Welcome to the BNS fall and winter program. So what we decided to do is for the fall and possibly through the winter, is to have a theme that we call biodiversity. And biodiversity, I think, is a term that everybody's heard about, but I'm not so sure that the meaning is totally clear. So I thought I would start with a little overview of what biodiversity is, and that's very much from my perspective and my angle of looking at biodiversity. So, and I might just also mention that we're starting here in September, and we have quite a program lined up. So there's a webinar today. The board meeting that you're welcome to sit in on is on this Wednesday. On this Saturday, the 18th, I'm doing a forest walk up on North Mountain, and I believe I have sent that information around. It is on the website under the program. The following week, Monday, we have the regular meeting, and that's going to be a very special one. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the following Saturday, we have the mushroom course, which Alison Walker is putting on up at Ross Creek Center for the Arts. And I think that's it, but that's quite a bit for September. So we're starting off with quite a slate, I would say. Anyway, so biodiversity, what is it? And I think biodiversity is a term that by now everybody's heard about. Certainly the politicians in their debates are talking about biodiversity and climate change. And the debate we had last week, biodiversity was certainly a term that was used. But I just wonder if, I think that to a lot of people, biodiversity is really what we might call species diversity, that it's just like how many species are there? But biodiversity is so much more. Now, politically, I think politicians are solving the biodiversity crisis by designating protected areas, and I'm not totally sure that is really what's going to protect biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is a term that has evolved over time. It is by now a relatively old term, but in 1974, for example, people concerned about conservation started to talk about nature's diversity. Then in 1980, 1985, we began to hear the term biological diversity. And then in 1988, biodiversity first appeared in publications, but it wasn't really until 1992 that biodiversity gained prominence. And that was because of the Rio Convention, where the UN's Rio Convention on biodiversity came about, and this was the turning point. And in 1988, the Brundtland Commission had stated that we should try to protect 12% of the landscape. And at the Rio Convention, this notion of setting aside protected areas was moved, and in fact, Canada was one of the first signatories to this convention. Now, it's only very recently, for example, that Nova Scotia reached 12% protection. So it took a long time for that number to be reached. The number has been increased to 17%. And I believe it's also stated that it should be 25% that needs protection. But if you within the academic circles, there are arguments that it should be 50%. And I think it's kind of the wrong approach to some degree to think that we can just set nature aside, keep humans out, and then we will have conserved biodiversity. Because biodiversity fundamentally is so much more. Now, when we set areas aside, to me, that is somewhat akin to stamp collecting. You know, we collect the stamps and then we have them and we don't need to worry about them anymore. Or you could also think of this as kind of a zoological gardens approach. Nature is dynamic. And to think that we can just cordon off certain areas and have biodiversity there or protect species there, that I think kind of misses the point. The point, as I'll get to towards the end, is that we humans need to realize that we are very much a part of nature, and we have to conduct our activities in such a way that we do not harm biodiversity wherever it occurs. Anyway, I'll get around to that. So what I want to talk a little bit about is the evolution of species very briefly, and then I will talk about the concept of worldview, which I think is essential in understanding our approach. And then I'll come up to some conclusions. Now, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. You'll see at the bottom, there is a chat box. And you can write your questions there, or you can just unmute yourself when the time comes and ask the questions. So, oh, and you probably realize by now that I'm not going to be sharing slides. So typically in science presentations, there are lots of slides and graphs and whatnot, but I've chosen not to do that because then very quickly it becomes very academic. So I'm just going to talk, not off the top of my head, but you know, somewhat off the top of my head. I have made a few notes. Good. So the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and for the first billion years, it was you know, basically a molten rock floating in space that slowly solidified, and then by about 3.5 billion years ago is when the first microbes started to appear, and for about 3 billion years, there were only bacteria around, and they diversified greatly during that time. Some of them began to be able to photosynthesize and produce oxygen, and this, of course, became a toxic gas to the anaerobic bacteria that then had to hide into places where there was no oxygen. Then about approximately half a billion years ago, 500 million years ago, multicellular life arose, and then there was an explosion in the diversity of organisms that took off. And most of the phyla that we know today originated very early on, which is rather amazing, I think, because we tend to think of the vertebrates, us, as being highly evolved. Well, we started out, you know, more or less right at the beginning. So during the last 500 million years ago, there's been this explosion in diversity, but there's also been 5 major mass extinction events. And the last extinction events, some 65 million years ago, was the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. And this was most likely a meteor, a giant meteor that struck down near the Yucatan Peninsula. So extinctions have taken place in the past, and after each extinction, there was a massive explosion of new species. So the number of species today, we really don't know how many there are. We have put names on about 1.7 million species, but estimates are that there might be 5 million, there might be 10 million. Some people say more than that. Now, clearly, these species that we haven't discovered yet are very small species, but occasionally we do suddenly find a new large species, generally in the tropics. So the number of species existing today represents some, and again, it varies, but about 2% to 0.1% of the species that ever existed. So most species exist for a while and then either die out or evolve into new species. Now, the diversity of species that we have today is the greatest that it has ever been. So the explosion of species has gone up and just keeps increasing and increasing. So the number of species, the variation is huge now compared to what it ever was. And now, of course, we often hear that in the Anthropocene, this is the period that we're living within, that we are causing massive extinction of species. Now, some of the species we know about, but many of the species that are disappearing are estimates based on destruction of habitats fundamentally, because it's the lack of habitat that is detrimental to species existence. If the habitat isn't there, the species disappear. And this is why we're so concerned about, clear cutting of the tropical forest, indeed clear cutting here in Nova Scotia, clear cutting anywhere, and basically changing landscapes, changing habitats for human use. So now, what do we know about how what it is that maintains the species? So I talked a little bit about the importance of habitat. Well, we know, we're slowly beginning to know more and more about how ecosystems function, but it's going very slow. And if any of you have read this fascinating book here, Finding the Mother Tree, this is a must read, I feel, because in it, Suzanne Simard presents how she discovered that trees communicate via mycorrhizal fungi. It's absolutely amazing how, our notion has been that trees were basically independent in forests. They might have been, like, we've known about mycorrhizal fungi, but it was just thought that mycorrhizal fungi associated with the roots of trees and helped get nutrients to the trees, and the trees provided nutrients to the mycorrhizal fungi. But Suzanne Simard has discovered that the trees are interconnected via the mycorrhizal fungi. So a lot of trees, it's like a giant network, and big trees will send nutrients to small trees. And ironically, I think the disturbing fact is that big trees will send nutrients to other species in the forest, not just their own species, but it's very complicated. They also send signals to each other if there are insects that are attacking them. And amazingly, if a large tree is about to die, it preferentially sends nutrients to its own offspring, not just the same species, but its own offspring. So this network that exists underground is phenomenal in how it maintains the structure and composition of forests. And this is really changing how we view how ecosystems work. So we're slowly beginning to understand the complexity found within ecosystems, and it is indeed highly complex. And I would venture to say that we're only just beginning to understand this complexity. Now, the real problem arises, of course, when we think we know how ecosystems function, and we then begin to manipulate them for our benefit. And one of the, Suzanne Simard is a forester, and she has been trying for years to get the forestry companies to realize that clear cutting is detrimental to the regeneration of forests. And she has shown that when you leave big trees and several of them behind and don't clear cut, that the regeneration of the trees is far better than when you totally clear cut an area and then plant again or just let natural regeneration take place. But of course, what's driving the forestry industry is profit and not the interest in regrowing trees. Regrowing trees is important. However, it's the money in the bank that's more important, I would argue. We also know that when we disturb ecosystems, that some of them are not very resilient. And resilience refers to the notion that you can if an ecosystem is disturbed, then it comes back to what it used to be fairly quickly. Now we're in our understanding of this, we've always thought that over time an area will come back to what it used to be. However, we clearly know now that, for example, dry savanna habitats, if they become overgrazed, they can experience what's called desertification. That is, they become deserts, and then they have gone from one state, that is a dry savanna, to a new state of desert, and they don't come back to the dry savanna state again. We also ironically thought back in the 90s, when the cod fishery collapsed in the North Atlantic along the Canada and the States, that all we had to do was stop fishing for a little bit and then the cod would come back. Well, I think we've learned a lesson there, that in fact we can disturb a species and they may not return to the state. The populations may not return to the state that they were before. And who knows what will happen to the cod, but they're clearly not back yet. And when a population is disturbed, such as the cod were, where we caught all the big ones preferentially, then indeed the cod now may be quite a different species, in a sense, where they're not the same size and they reproduce at an earlier age and produce, and they're physically a smaller species. So we trying to understand how nature work has been is a long, slow process, and our very simple notions of how they work in the beginning are continually being we have to rethink, because indeed ecosystems are complex, and we often call them complex adaptive systems. So now, the interesting thing is, of course, that if we bring in indigenous knowledge, then quite often when Western science discovers something, then suddenly we realize that, oh, indigenous people have been saying this for a long time. And then we are amazed that, how could they know that? Well, I think we forget that, say in North America, let's take Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq have been here for over 10,000 years. And in 10,000 years, there has been ample time to observe how nature works. And in observing how it works, in fact, you can learn just as much as you can by carrying out experiments. And in fact, observations over a very long period are probably more reliable than some short-term experiment where many of the conditions would vary over time, so that we only know what a little snapshot from an experiment of how nature works. So, but I could talk, for hours about ecosystems and how they work. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the concept of world view, because our understanding of how nature works is really informed and constrained by our worldview. And worldview is a term that we use to how should I put it? The worldview is how we explain things around us, and that has varied over time. So the Western worldview, I think we can call, some people call it the Newtonian worldview, or you could call it the mechanical worldview. This worldview basically started in the late 1600s, early 1700s and on. And this was a time when philosophers such as René Descartes, John Locke, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and the economist Adam Smith began to write and think that we really should use our knowledge to control nature. And indeed, John Locke said, for example, that the role of the state is to subjugate nature. So this was a time when there was a rise in intellectualism, you could say, and it was a time when people began to say that we don't have to be fatalistic. We can take charge of things. We can use our knowledge to control nature for our benefit. And we fundamentally still live with that notion. So out of this came science as we know it today. It slowly began to take hold that we humans could use science to understand how nature worked and use that knowledge for our own benefit. And basically that is what we've been doing ever since, that time, 1600s, 1700s. So science has become a very powerful way of knowing. But I think it's important to realize that it is only one way of knowing. There are other ways of knowing things. And we can talk about, there's belief, which is not a very powerful way of knowing. There is, if you're told something and don't question it, well, that's another way of knowing. There's intuition, and there is traditional ecological knowledge, which is a way of knowing. So there are different ways of knowing. But we currently live under this mechanical worldview, where it is science that we use as a way of knowing. And as I said, it is a powerful way of knowing, but it is not the only way of knowing. And indeed, sometimes if we only use science, I think it will limit things. Although, like, science is certainly advancing continuously, and we may never know the ultimate of what there is to know. But the real problem is that when we think we know how something works and then manipulate nature and are surprised. So, for example, the current rise in CO2 and global warming is one of those problems. And I think the loss of biodiversity is another one. Now, let's see, where am I? Yeah, so science, so the mechanical worldview, we call it the mechanical worldview because it assumes that the human body, the universe, ecosystems are like machines. And machines are made up of parts. And if we understand, like if we take the structure apart and we study each of those parts, then we often assume that we can put it back together again and understand the whole. But I think ecologists have for a long time known that there are what we call emergent properties. And emergent properties are things that could not be explained on the basis of understanding the parts. But this is still how we approach our understanding of things, that they're fundamentally like machines. So for example, medicine is still very much an area where we have doctors that specialize in different parts. So there are respiration physiologists, there are people that study hearts, there are doctors that study the kidney. If you ever go to a doctor, then immediately one is sent to a specialist, and the specialist knows a lot about the heart or the brain or whatever, but often very little about something else. And of course, the Garrett Hardin's definition of a specialist is somebody who knows a lot about a little. But this is fundamentally what we still live under, is this notion that ecosystems, the species, etc., are made up of parts, and all we need to do is study and understand the parts, and then we can understand the whole. It is still pervasive, even though I think more and more people realize that no, this is not how it works. It is far more complex. And if we look at, for example, I can look up in a table when high tide is going to be on September the 13th, 2025, and it'll be right on. We'll know when full moon is going to be over the next many years, etc. So at that scale, we can predict into the future. But when it comes to ecosystems, how they function, then that was just a chat note, sorry. Then I think we are beginning to, or we have known for a while, that ecosystems are exceedingly complex and not easily understood. Now, the fascinating thing about worldview and the way we see the world, it also affects our language. So Western language is noun-based. That is, we put a name on things, and quite often we think that if we know the name of something, then we understand it. But of course, we don't. And again, back to the medical system, some years ago, I began to have kind of like a funny left leg. And I went to see the doctor, and I was immediately sent to a neurologist. And the neurologist did all kinds of tests on me and told me, "You have neuropathy." And I said, "Wonderful. What caused it and how can we cure it?" "Oh, we don't know what causes it and we don't know how to cure it. So you have to live with it." So and there's an example of, they can put a name on something, but that was it. And it was almost assumed that because the doctor could put a name on it, that I should be satisfied. Well, I don't think we should ever be satisfied if all we know is the name of something. But fundamentally, Western science is noun-based. We put names on things, and that comes from our mechanical worldview that we know, that we think it's the parts that are important. Now, when it comes to indigenous languages, and if we take Mi'kmaq, and we'll hear more about that next week, then indigenous languages tend to be verb-based. That is, they're based on actions. And the actions, depending on where and how they take place, can have different names. So for example, walking can have many different names depending on where you walk, how long you walk, etc. So walking through a forest might have one term, whereas walking down a hill another term. So their language is very much tied to their activity in nature. And because the language is tied so closely to nature, that gives them a totally different perspective of how we humans are a part of nature. And one of the things I've neglected to say, of course, is that with the mechanical worldview that arose there, like I said, in Europe in the 1700s, that basically separated humans from nature. And in fact, Descartes talking about, I think, therefore I am, even separates, the head from our bodies in a sense, so that so that our thinking part is not a part of our bodies, which of course is ridiculous. So worldviews are essential in understanding who we are and how we relate to nature around us, and how we assume that we can use nature for our benefit. And I think we're obviously beginning to learn that we really cannot do that. We do have to pay attention to our impact on nature. But still, our solutions, I believe, are not reflect what we ultimately really need to do. So, so that was a little bit about worldview. So what's needed? Well, I think that first of all, we humans, we need to kind of get back into nature. We need to understand and appreciate that we are a part of biodiversity. We are part of the natural world, and our actions can have dire consequences for the resilience of biodiversity. And so this notion that all we need to do is set aside some protected areas across the landscape and we will have protected biodiversity, to me, is the wrong approach. What we need to do is understand that we are a part of the biodiversity around us. We are a part of nature, and that we need to conduct our activity in a sense that maintains the resilience of nature, that is, maintains its ability to come back when disturbed. And until we can do that, we are not going to be very successful. So, for example, if we look at farming currently, and certainly farming in the valley here, but farming in general, it is becoming more and more industrial. So the scale is increasing at an enormous rate. Farming, the fertility of the land is maintained by massive addition of fertilizer that is fossil fuel based, and there's a massive input in fossil fuels to produce the crops that we depend on. And in fact, it's been stated that the amount of energy that goes into farming is far greater than the amount of energy we get out of it in terms of the food we eat. And that clearly is unsustainable. So that we need to begin to understand how soils work, understand that the biodiversity, the organisms in the soil are central to the fertility of the soil, which is necessary for the production of the crops. We need to understand that in forestry, it's the same way. If we totally clear cut an area, there are dramatic ecological effects. And yes, in certain areas, such as the northern hardwood forest and the boreal forest are quite resilient. They can be clear cut and come back. But evidence from Europe has certainly found that after 5 or 6 rotations of clear cutting, and then the fertility of the soil is gone. So there is an example of how, if we begin to understand how nature works, and how indigenous people have been saying how nature works for eons, then I think we can properly protect biodiversity. And I could give many more examples. So biodiversity to me is this concept that we need to live, I'll say, in harmony with nature as opposed, and within nature as opposed to living outside of nature and in disharmony. Now, next week we are going to hear a talk partly titled Awakening the Sleeping Giant. And this talk is going to be done by Karen Beasley, Elder Albert Marshall from Cape Breton, a Mi'kmaq person, and Lisa Young, I think it's Lisa. It's certainly Young is her last name, is a Mi'kmaq, and they are going to be talking about the indigenous perspective of biodiversity fundamentally. And I'm really excited that Elder Albert Marshall is going to be giving the presentation, because he is the one who came up with this concept of two-eyed seeing. And two-eyed seeing, it means that we need to use Western science, but we also need to use indigenous traditional knowledge in order to understand what we're doing and how we should do things. So this is going to be, I think, amazing, because I read a paper that they published, and it was just, it hit bullseye, I would say. Anyways, so a relatively short talk, but I didn't want this to be too long. And if you have any questions now, we can enter that phase and go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away, or write your questions in the chat box. I know I covered quite a bit of information, but I'm hoping that I presented it in a very non-academic fashion. Thank you. Any questions?
Can I pop in?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, John.
Hi. Lynn and I watched a series on television on TV Ontario,
Yeah.
are called about the UNESCO biospheres in Canada.
Yes,
And
yes, I've seen them.
Has at least two. I think Nova Scotia has two, and it shows. I think it was a wonderful example of how humans and nature can work together, and I think there's some wonderful examples, like of how the Mi'kmaq fish or do aquaculture in the Brador Lakes, and at the same time enhance the biosphere of the lake, or the biodiversity of the lake.
Yes.
That they both work together. And they show examples of this across Canada, where highways have basically cut the ability of animals to cross from one side to the other, like turtles or even larger animals, and how we have to build ways for the animals to get across from one side to the other to maintain the biodiversity.
Yes.
I would recommend anybody. I'm sure you can find it online. I should have looked at this beforehand.
Well, we can send it out. We can send it out.
I will let you know. I'm sure that it's all recorded on YouTube or somewhere. Yes. But they're very good. They're narrated by Jim Cuddy from Blue Rodeo, and who actually is very good at narrating it. And so it's well written, well done. And I didn't even realize Canada had these biodomes, or and including ones that are right outside big cities like Montreal. There's one that's run by McGill. It was a research station from McGill, and which is one of those, if you've ever gone to Montreal, you'd see those like kind of mountains on the flat plains.
Yes.
You approach Montreal, and it's one of those, and it goes right into the village or the town that's one of the suburbs of Montreal, and how they reclaimed nature in that area. It's really, really amazing.
Yeah. No, I have, John, after we spoke last time, I watched some of those programs as well. And I totally agree that they're amazing. And I think it's wonderful. It's absolutely amazing and wonderful that there are people who are more concerned about trying to work with nature than against nature, and showing that in fact it works. And I think, like, I'm hopeful that more and more people will begin to realize that when you work with nature, you know, you're going to be more satisfied in your work, and you're also going to see the benefit in terms of the biodiversity in your area, and in fact in terms of probably ultimately crop yields. So yes, those programs are amazing. The one that I saw some years ago, and I think I sent it around to the BNS membership, was the one on the Yellowstone National Park, where they showed that once the wolves were introduced to the park, that the rivers in the park began to change course, because the elk were then pushed away, vegetation grew up along the rivers, the beavers came in, and that began to change the whole ecosystem. So, and it's so funny, I think, that we are amazed at this. You know, we shouldn't be amazed that nature, after 500 million years of evolution, you know, knows best, type of thing. So thanks. Anybody else with questions? Don't be shy. Yeah, I see John just put up in the chat box, tvo.org, striking balance. So
I found it immediately.
Yeah.
So the site is tvo.org, which is TV Ontario, and the show is called Striking Balance.
Yeah, and it's
all
free.
All the episodes are there.
Yeah, and you don't need.
The Southwest Nova Biosphere Reserve is the first one.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of people in Nova Scotia do not really know this. Oh, I see Karen put her hand up. Karen, you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can write it in the chat box.
Hi, Soren, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, I just thought I'd check because I'm not sure why my video isn't working, but I'll try to make sure that's fixed by next week. Or
okay, there's at the very bottom, Karen, there should be a mute button and a video button. And if you click the video,
it's not making a difference, Soren.
Oh,
so I think I just need to restart my computer. This happens on occasion. Yeah, so
okay.
Anyways, I just want to say how much I enjoyed your talk, and also how impressed I was at how you covered it in such a relatively short time, like so many different dimensions of what biodiversity is. So the folks on the call wouldn't know, but I've been studying biodiversity for a long time, so I know what it means. And my goodness, I think it would be a challenging thing to talk about and sum up the way you have. And so I just wanted to congratulate you for that.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks.
Yeah. And yeah, I would say that I really, this isn't a question so much, but I really took heart what you said about, you know, protected areas, and, you know, they're good and an important tool in the toolbox. Otherwise, we'd have the kind of highways that John was referring to pretty much everywhere. But, but yes, they don't do anything really to help us address the fundamental or root cause, that being that so many of us in our governance systems and our ways of thinking and our economic systems and all those things are so based in that worldview that you talked about,
Right.
that kind of shows us as being separate from nature somehow.
Yeah.
And, we just really have to start living as though we are a part of it. And I think that's one of the things that's really key to Indigenous worldviews, not just here in Nova Scotia and Canada, but pretty much globally. They all would see themselves as inherently part and parcel of nature and unable, to be separated. And there is this saying, people need land. We're not going to survive without land and water. But also land needs people.
Yeah.
And it helps to get over that idea that the kinds of things people do are damaging, and introduces the idea that we're part of nature and we could be just as helpful to nature and just as important to nature as the mother tree is that you were talking about,
Yes.
if we just behaved true to our natures.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I just maybe should just say that I don't want to be suggest that protected areas are not important. I think parks and protected areas, they serve an important function, because it is probably one of the few places where people nowadays can go to be in nature that is not impacted by human, let's say, industries. Um, and that is important. So they're, like, from an educational perspective, I think that they are critical. I do think it's very sad when people are in protected areas or parks can't, um, let's say, can't, aren't allowed to do, like, to be within it. So I think the protected areas, it's like a mirage in a sense, where you can go there and you can look in, but you can't be part of it. And that is what's missing, and that sends the wrong message. Um, but um, but they certainly are important. It's just that protected areas, I don't feel, are ever going to be what truly protects biodiversity. I might just come back to a point that John raised, and Karen, you brought up as well, about the roads, etc. I One of the last things I did as a prof at Acadia before I retired was to study black bears. And I had a student, and some of you will have heard that story because she gave a talk on it. But you'll recall that black bears in Nova Scotia are the ones that live in the southern part, basically south of Highway 102, the one from Truro to Halifax. Below that highway are genetically distinct from the ones that are north of that highway. And it seems, and we know that black bears are reluctant to cross double laned highways. And so this road between Truro and Halifax may in fact be a barrier to black bear dispersal in the province. And the movement of organisms is essential for their survival. Without movement, populations are not doing very well. So even something like a highway can impact large organisms. We certainly know that they can be detrimental to small organisms. And there are examples in Europe, for example, where they have to build tunnels under major highways so that organisms can cross, whether it's frogs or snakes or whatever. So yeah, highways are bad. Any other questions? Please ask some questions. Well, if there aren't any, then I would like to thank you for joining this webinar. And I highly encourage that you tune in next Monday for the regular BNS meeting, because it is, I guarantee it's going to be phenomenal. And I will send out the link. The link will be available as usual on the BNS webpage. There's a tab called Activity, and under the activity, there's the program. And the program, under the program, it will be the link to how to join it, and they will be recorded. This presentation this evening indeed was recorded, and it will be put up so that you can view it at a later date. So and I think I've covered everything. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see each other again next Monday. It'll still be a Zoom meeting next Monday, but we'll see what happens in terms of opening up, whether we continue the Zoom meeting or what. I did see that over the weekend there were 76 COVID cases in Nova Scotia, unfortunately. But hopefully we will prevent a fifth wave so that we can begin to meet in person again. But we'll keep you posted. Thank you very much, and
thank you.
Next Monday. Good. Thanks,
Thank you.
Lee. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.